Good evening, everybody. I'm just the guy welcoming you to the Autry. I don't need applause, but okay. My name is Ben Fitzsimmons, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs here at the Autry, and I'm really, really pleased to welcome so many of you here tonight. Before we begin, it is important that we acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva, and we want to recognize them as the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. So how many of you, as well as the bar and the tacos, had a chance to duck into the museum and take a look at our exhibition dress codes? Good, there are some hands. Great. If you didn't, do come back to the museum sometime and take a look. With the title of Clothing, Coding, and Defiance in the 19th-Century West, it's easy to see why this program is closely tied to the exhibition, exploring as it does gender and racial codes and the way they were controlled and defied in the 19th century. We're thrilled that the panel discussion following the screening will feature two scholars who literally wrote the books on these subjects. Clare Sears, author of Arresting Dress, Cross-Dressing, Law, and Fascination in the 19th Century San Francisco, and Nayan Shah, author of Stranger Intimacy, Contesting Race, Sexuality, and the Law in the North American West. But as many of you know, this is also the LA premiere of the film The Cosmopolitan West. Somehow I knew that would get a round of applause. This film is inspired by the story of Pearl Hart, an outlaw who was celebrated in Cosmopolitan magazine wearing clothing traditionally seen as male clothing. I saw this movie at the Pioneertown International Film Festival just after the exhibition dress codes opened, and I was struck by the contrast between Pearl Hart wearing men's clothing in a national magazine and being celebrated and featured as such. But during the same period, there were laws on the books in many cities in the West, including San Francisco, specifically making it illegal to wear clothing assigned to the opposite sex. So these two elements tie together in a way that really reinforces the ideas and themes of the exhibition. So I'm really pleased that we're able to bring everything together and bring so many of you here. As I said, if you haven't seen the exhibition, if you haven't been inside the galleries, do come back. Now you know where we are. There's some great stuff inside. So I'm going to hand it over to Molly Ratermann, the director and star of the Cosmopolitan West, to introduce her film, which will be followed by the panel diving deeper into these questions and issues, led by the Autry's chief curator and lead curator on dress codes, Carolyn Brucken. But now, Molly.
Hello. Woo! Oh my goodness, it's been a long time to get here. So thank you for showing up. This is the coolest night probably of my career. So you're part of it so far. But thank you for coming, seriously. I think we're gonna have a really fun night. Did everyone get some tacos and a lot of alcohol? Okay, great. All right, I was trying to sauce you up, so that's good. All right, great. Well, look, did everyone get a little pamphlet and everything? Everyone? Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. So if you haven't seen the film before, you'll find out more about that. But the exciting news is that we are expanding the project into a feature film. So, hey. Yeah, I like that. Where's the yeehaws in the room? Get more yeehaws. Yeah, I like that. There's a little bit of information in there. If you're interested more, the QR code, as we all are now very aware of, it'll lead you to Saba, our amazing producer in the back here. She is leading the charge on that feature film. So we're really, really excited about it. I would like to honor any cast and crew in here. Please stand up. All right. Woo, woo. Thank you guys for joining this crazy journey. The people who were in the desert had an actual insane journey, and the people who are just at the Western film set had the best time of their life. So it was quite the time. But you know what? We're really excited to be here. Ben, thank you so much. Rob, up in the house up there, thank you so much. They've been incredible. So the Autry Museum actually helped with my research for the feature film. So before I even met Ben and before we even screened at Pioneer Town, I had been here a lot, maybe too much. So when they approached me, that was like, the craziest moment. I'm like, the Autry Museum? You are kidding me. And my family is here. A lot of my family is here. Yeah. They're most of my inspirations. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. I know I'm making this long, but I'm, I can see your faces. So anyway, I really wanted to highlight that history is extremely important to me, and this film was a blast to make with amazing people. I really hope you enjoy it, and let's have a blast of a night. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming back upstage. It's the first time I followed a premiere film, which is very exciting.
Amazing.
But I want to thank Molly both for partnering for the Autry on the premiere, and especially for being so enthusiastic about the idea of broadening the premiere to a larger conversation and discussion tonight. And so I thank you for that. And it's a pleasure to really introduce a very talented group here on stage tonight. We've just watched Molly Ratermann's film, but it bears repeating her awards. She has had international attention with over 25 industry awards, 12 shorts, multiple streaming series, and a TV pilot. And we're very excited to know that you were a semi-finalist in the Mark Duplass Screencraft Film Fund to do a feature-length script for the Cosmopolitan West. Clare Sears, on the far left here, is an associate professor of sociology and sexuality studies at San Francisco State University. As we mentioned, author of the book Arresting Dress, Cross-Dressing Law and Fascination in 19th-Century San Francisco, which was shortlisted for the Lambda Literary Award and co-winner of the Committee on LGBT History John Boswell Award. Very good. And they also shared that they're working on two upcoming projects. One is a collection of essays examining interplay of sexuality, gender, and psychiatric disability in law and public culture. And one I'm even more excited about, which is a novel set in 1870 San Francisco that takes up the questions of sex obsession and historical memory to explore contemporary attachments to the queer and trans past. We're also joined by Nayan Shah, who's a historian whose books uncover how people struggle with migration, incarceration, and illness in the US and across the globe. Shah is professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California and has written two award-winning books on the experience of Asian Americans in the West, including Contagious Divides, Epidemics and Race in San Francisco Chinatown, and Stranger Intimacy, Contesting Race, Sexuality, and the Law in the North American West. Also working on a book. You guys are all very busy people. His latest book is called Refusal to Eat, A Century of Prison Hunger Strikes. It will be the first global history of hunger strikes as a tactic in prisons, conflicts, and protest movements. So I'm not sure that any of you officially would consider yourselves card-carrying Western historians, though I think you should. And so I want to start with that question about the place of the West in each of your works. I am going to begin with you, Molly, and just kind of ask you what inspired you initially to choose a Western character and setting.
Yeah, well, my mother, somewhere in the audience, she had us watching Westerns while we were growing up. And the Westerns back then were not really depressing. They were really fun and had a lot of witty lines. And, there's this very wild spirit, this very, huge opportunity in the West. And you can be anyone you want, And so the West was always exciting to me in that way. I grew up in California. I've always held that kind of I think the wild of the West is like, as obvious as that is, it really is the wild of the West. I think that really spoke to me. And so when I came across the story of Pearl Hart, that was something that really I related to, mixture of, this tomboy ending up in the Cosmopolitan magazine, which I grew up with the Cosmo magazine as, oh man, my ass isn't big enough. Oh man, like I can't put my leg like that, So how many girls in here? Yeah, exactly. And then, you have your things too, but women, I'm sorry for all of us. Anyway, so the Cosmo magazine, seeing this tomboy who, that's what I was growing up, was just a massive tomboy. All I was seen as was a little boy, and I had the best time of my life. And so I think when I saw this other tomboy in the Cosmo magazine, which was the same thing that gave me a complex, for starting at 14, I really, really resonated with that. And so I think I dove deeper into that excitement that my mom initially kind of sparked in me.
Yeah. And may I ask both Nayan and Clare, why does the West matter to your work in that sense?
Well, I'll start. I grew up in Maryland, and so cowboys and Indians on U.S. Westerns, I was like, I'm not that kind of Indian. It was that kind of, it seemed so odd. So I was like kind of accidental Western historian. I've lived in California now 20 plus years, but I came to the research because there was this myth out there that it was just cowboys and Indians, and it was just white people conquering Native people, and that was the history. And I think I discovered through actually doing different kinds of research projects about how extraordinarily cosmopolitan, in the best sense of the word, like this incredible mix of people that lived here, that created this place, that imagines themselves part of it and belonging in it, but we often submerge that history, or we say it's just more very recent history. California's only been really diverse in the last 50 years, for instance. And that's just not true. So I thought it was so fascinating to discover the range of people that create a crossroads from the globe here in not just the big cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles, but in rural places, kind of like the places you were depicting, where there were people that were Portuguese and Chinese and Brazilian and people from Basque Spain and Scottish folks, and they were all trying to make a mixture of what this world is. And so I think for me, I will be speaking at the Western History Association meeting in 3 weeks in San Antonio. I've been invited to do this plenary on queer Western history. So that's cool. And so the Western historian's pretty much like, well, yeah, we always like to have a little diversity in the mix here. But I think what's really interesting, and it's been true for the last 25 plus years, is that race, sexuality, gender are really important lenses by which we can understand this extraordinary place that we're in and that we're constantly remaking.
Clare?
Okay. I also, I guess, got into studying the West really, really accidentally, and also history too. I'm not trained as a historian, but I was in graduate school, and I was really interested in the policing of like queer and trans communities in the mid 20th century, like when police would raid bars, in the sort of period that people often think of like right before like Stonewall. Right? So I was reading like autobiographies and oral histories of that time period, and I would keep coming across these accounts, like these really kind of brutal accounts of police raiding like gay bars at that time and arresting people for not wearing enough clothing that matched their appropriate sex, right? So you had to wear a certain number of items of clothing. So I became like really interested in that, this kind of like policing of sexuality through clothing rather than through sex, right? So in these accounts, there would always be like a footnote that would say like, that the police were presumably enforcing a local law against cross-dressing, but that the author wasn't able to find any more information. So I got interested just in these laws around cross-dressing, right? And I did a little bit of research and really quickly found that they were not mid-20th century innovations designed to harass like lesbians and gay men and trans people as I'd expected, but had their roots in the mid-19th century when over 40 cities, like across the US, passed these laws that made it a crime to appear in public wearing clothing that didn't belong to your sex. And a lot of those laws, the original laws, were passed in the West. So I really didn't know that much about the US West. I didn't grow up in the US. I had this kind of like mythology, you know? But kind of like Nayan, as soon as I began to read more of that history, I realized that there was so much more there than I realized, right? And I just became fascinated with what was going on in this place at this time around gender and the perceived needs to police gender norms, and really quickly found out this was about gender, but it was also about sexuality, it was also about race, it was also about nation, and that's kind of how I got there, I guess.
Well, I want to follow up on that because I think Claire and Molly, both of you center cross-dressing practices in your historical research as well as your artistic work. And when we were having conversations before this, we talked about it's a bit of a slippery term at the same time. And so I was curious, in what ways do you find cross-dressing both a useful term to think or create with, or where also maybe are its limits? And you can like toss a coin, decide who goes first.
Your film. All right. Well, a little nervous. Claire is sort of the expert on this. Yeah, I mean, look, cross-dressing, I think, is only a term because we have put labels on what is male clothing, what is female clothing. So if there weren't those labels, there isn't such thing as cross-dressing. You're just wearing clothes, period, at the end of the day. So I think that's where it becomes a slippery slope. I think it's helpful in terms of people. That's what they understand. You know, we as humans, that's natural for us to put things in boxes and categories and things like that. So I think cross-dressing, that's when it's useful, or in an empowering way, I would say, is a good way to use cross-dressing to someone who might not realize that terminology could be not harmful, but maybe not accurate.
And may I ask what it felt like as an actress putting on the different costumes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very obvious that, you know, she obviously had to change her clothing to be believable, to be a woman in peril. So, you know, that's a very obvious kind of show of the difference in clothing and what that tells to different people around you. Yeah, I guess as an actress, I'm going to be fully honest, I didn't have a lot of time to think. So the men's clothing was much comfier and the women's clothing was extremely frustrating. So that's really where it came from. I had this skirt and I can only, you know, move my legs so far, and I'm trying to get all the way across to where we're shooting, across the desert. So in that sense, that's really what I was noticing on set, was just the, and you know, I think that's a big part in history is women's skirts became tighter and tighter. And the reason for that was actually to, you know, oppress women in a way of, you know, well, they can only walk so fast and do so much and bend so much, you know, that sort of a thing. So, you know, it seems insane actually that was that thought through, but it was, so.
And I know, Claire, you explore many of the different reasons why people potentially cross-dressed as well. And so.
Yeah, I mean, I used that term in my book. You know, I'm not sure if I would use it now. I do think it serves a useful purpose. But people, one of the tricky things about the term is it sort of implies that there's just one thing, like cross-dressing is one thing, when many people wore clothing that did not belong to their sex for a whole host of reasons, right? So for some people, it would be like a kind of like temporary thing, you know, while migrating to make the journey easier, or like you said, clothing is more comfortable or facilitates an ease of movement, right? But clothing assumes gendered meaning that the society at the time is putting on it, right? And those meanings are contested. But for a lot of people, wearing a particular set of clothing is a way to communicate a felt gender identity, right? And that's a different kind of cross-dressing. One of the things that I was really interested in my work is the way that the meaning of clothing shifts at different times. So again, cross-dressing can get problematic because it sort of implies that this is men's clothing, this is women's clothing. Everybody agrees on what that is, and that's never contested and it never changes, right? Whereas I was actually looking at court cases where, like in the courtroom, it was debated, what kind of pants a woman could wear and it still be legal, right? That would still count as women's clothing. And that changed over time. But the other thing that's problematic about the term is it not only assumes that clothing can be easily and, sort of consensually divided into male and female, but the bodies can too. Right? And even looking in sort of like the mid-19th century, I came across countless cases of people who insisted in the courtroom, like, I have a right to wear these men's clothing because I'm a man, while acknowledging that they'd been assigned female at birth. Or the inverse of that too, people insisting that they had a right to wear women's clothing while acknowledging that they'd been assigned male at birth. Right? And then there were cases of people, again, in court, like under, really difficult circumstances, who would say, I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, you cannot classify me in those ways, right? So things that we often think about, or some people would think about now as more like contemporary gender identities, I was finding that they were also, really, really prevalent in the mid-19th century onwards. Maybe, not expressed in the same language that we would use today, but definitely recognizable.
And again, this panel is in conversation with dress codes, which is exploring really the ways we use clothing to express everything from belonging to individuality to protest and aspirations. And I'm curious, because when we first reached out, especially I think to Nayan and Clare, what was your actual honest first reaction when we were telling you we were going to ask you to speak about dress codes?
Well, I was just curious. I was like, what kind of dress are you talking about? I'm really glad I got to see the exhibit because I really could understand a little bit about clothing is a signal. It signals many things that you may think about what you want to project, some things that you feel like you need to project because someone's not taking you seriously. People can take and remake clothing in a variety of different ways. So it really asks the question, sometimes you don't know that there's subterranean meanings for using, if you're wearing jeans or if you're, wearing a particular kind of Hawaiian shirt. I was really fascinated to sort of see that layering happen and understand that Hawaiian shirts, for instance, they were excess fabric for kimonos that Japanese and Chinese tailors were fitting for Filipino workers who wanted to dress really fly in the 1930s. They weren't meant for American white tourists, right? But then they got reappropriated and acquired so that people who were indigenous Hawaiian or people who are from other parts of the world or people who are, Chicano in LA would wear them because they wanted to sort of project a different kind of meaning about who they are and what they believe in. So I do think that bodies are constantly transforming, and we are both interested in fitting people into certain kinds of categories so that we can engage with them or something like that, or so that we can typify where they belong in society. We're, very stratified societies both then and now. And there's also a lot of flux. People are playing around with what can feel comfortable, what's easy, what feels like the self-sense fit, this feels good on me, or I look hot in this, or I may not get assaulted if I wear this. And that's, I think one of the most interesting probably challenges for you, Molly, right, with the story that you're telling, because there are a lot of people, a lot of women or people who were assigned female at birth who migrated to the West or transformed in the West in order to find work and definitely disguised their sense of projecting a gender that would see them as feminine, vulnerable, liable for assault. And so that's another part of the story that you're so playing with. Like, I think it's great the way you play it, but it's just like, that's for real, right? That there were so many different instances of people sort of figuring out ways of navigating their life, having work and livelihood and survival, because they could use dress as well as what they were capable of doing to push back against someone who thought they were a mark, and could harm them.
Yeah, thank you for catching that. I mean, yeah, I think females in that time period, it was a lot more than, I think nowadays we do tie a lot to our clothing without realizing it, our sexuality or gender or all these, there's our socioeconomic status, whatever that might be, right? And Claire can speak more to that because that's those laws from that era sort of have, obviously expanded today. It's, So I guess for females back then, wearing men's clothing sometimes was just a way to get respect. Sometimes it was a way to get a job that they wouldn't think she was normally capable to do. And in this case, Rose wants land of her own. And back then, you had the homestead agreement or whatever, where women could own so much acreage. If they weren't married, they were divorced, or they could not be divorced actually, or widowed. So that was their only way. If there's no men they could possibly get, well, you must be okay enough, I guess, to have land, because whatever. And so that was the American dream, so to speak, for women back then, was, wow, I can own my own land, I can have my own farm, I can have opportunity, I can have control over my money and my career, and I can strive for something. And so that's something that I think the West represented for a lot of women, but because it is the Wild West, people were just putting in these laws. A lot of towns, it was illegal to wear, men's clothing if you were female, all the above. So there was a lot of those obstacles back then, but clothing was it seems so simple in so many ways, but it really was so much more than just saying, well, I like these pants. It's like, there's so much more attached to it,
What I want to pick up on what all of you are saying is that there's both codes themselves, which are always changing and very contingent and dependent on a specific context. And then there's laws, which try to fix them in place, right? And so we use Defiance in the title of the program, but I think belonging might be the flip side of that.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if any of you are interested in speaking on kind of that tension between defiance and belonging and how it comes out in some of these issues. I know that's a very big question.
Sure, ask us the big questions. Fine. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Defiance happens, yes, individually, but it also happens socially, right? People wear similar kinds of things to sort of signal to each other that, like, oh, I'm, whether it's erotic interest or whether it's like a social interest or something like that. And then people also can actually target people because they wear certain kinds of clothing. And sort of, the endless history in the US West of the turban, which Sikh men wore when they came to the United States. And it literally was something that people would harass them around, wondered because they had unshorn, long hair that they covered. That was part of their religious practice. But they also wondered, well, are they really female because they have that long hair? If we strip them of that, and literally people would do this in the early 20th century, in the 1940s in Marysville. And in fact, after 9/11, people were doing that as well in Arizona and California and other places. So it's like, at the same time, strangely enough, the turban was a fashion statement produced out of 1920s Hollywood, and at very high-end, wealthy places, women would have their turbans created as part of a kind of fashionable hairstyle. So they could use it as fashion, and then people who were brown were suspect. So it's interesting about how that operates for the people that were, for the South Asian men who came in the early 20th century. they learned pretty fast that they should get rid of their turban if they wanted to assimilate to society and not be attacked. And so many of them did over time. They did, and then they also married Mexican women, and they became part of these families in the Imperial Valley and the Central Valley that are multi-generational, Punjabi Mexican families that we know about now. But it's always really curious that they were referred to in those communities as Hindus. They weren't Hindu. They were of the Sikh religion, but that's what they were called because that was a term that was used at the time. And I always found it really fascinating. I went to Imperial Valley, not far from some of the places you were filming in, and I went there in this was maybe 25 years ago. I was in a Denny's. I was asking a question about the Indian community there, and the woman was like, "Oh no, there's no casinos here. There are no Indians here." And I said, "No, I mean people from India." He says, "Oh, yeah, there's a doctor, somewhere like that." I said, "No, Hindus." And they're like, "Oh yeah, plenty of them. Like the person who owns this hotel, and oh, by the way, my great aunt married a Hindu, because she was an Okie, and this guy was pretty nice, and he had land, and she wanted to work with him, and we had this family and stuff like that." And I just a whole stream of things happened as soon as I learned to change language from what she was thinking and what was being signaled for her, some of which I have a lot of feeling had to do also with how people comported themselves, what they wore, class issues, all kinds of stuff. So it's just this unraveling that occurs in different ways. But it's important just to keep in mind that it's always socialized. And so it's in the law and it's in policing, but it's also in how people interact with each other, how they are eager to see someone or hostile to them. And that stuff is real.
Yeah.
It's also real around the women that you depicted, right? The cosmopolitan women, the women that were there was a certain kind of class standing. These are women who are not supposed to be working with their hands. These are women who are wearing these frilly outfits and they only care about how I can get my next hat, as opposed to your main character, right? Who had using her hands with the gun, but also, with the idea that she wanted to work the land. She was an equestrian, right? She wanted all those things. So it was also a set of values as well that's being played out by how she was dressing and what she wanted from her life.
Yeah. Wait, Claire, I think you were did you want to say something?
I mean, I can. There's just so much, I think, to think about here, and I'm trying to figure out. I mean, I know you'd asked about belonging and defiance, and there's so much to say there. I think this notion of belonging and the way that these dress codes in some ways are trying to really rigidly police belonging. This is how you belong in particular kind of gender categories. And then the way people can defy those and create community and different spaces of belonging. But I'm also thinking, Nayan, just what you were talking about, it's also making me think of a lot of the anti-Chinese laws in San Francisco in the 1870s, and particularly the Q ordinance that San Francisco that San Francisco had that allowed the city jailer to cut men's hair within an inch of their scalp, right? Which was this sort of specific targeting of Chinese men's distinctive hairstyles. So it's not dress, but I think when we're talking about dress, often it's about people's just physical appearance and ways that becomes a site of power and a site of struggle. But there's something else that I want to talk about too, because Molly, I'm thinking of your film and the Cosmopolitan cover. And, Ben had said this, introducing this kind of event, that there's this really interesting tension between sort of policing and regulation and the way that takes place, both through the state and also on an interpersonal level. And then this fascination, right? This kind of fascination with putting this image of the outlaw on the cover of a magazine. And I'm just kind of curious. I mean, obviously that's really central to your film. How you were thinking about that? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, well, if I'm just to reference it back to the actual Pearl Hart. So Pearl Hart's the outlaw that this is based off of. And Pearl Hart Well, she wanted a better life for her entire family, and obviously women back then to get money, it was like a double-edged sword. It's like, hey, look at this opportunity, but you got to buy in for this much money. So she was like, screw it. I'm going to look like a man, and I'm going to scare people at stagecoaches and rob them, and it's going to be great. And she was very successful until they caught her. And then she's in jail, and she ends up spewing this very feminist rhetoric in jail, becoming this feminist icon for women who, going back to belonging and identity, who felt they had to get rid of a lot of their authenticity to belong. So they might dress one way, but they really would rather be dressing a different way. They'd really rather be doing what Pearl Hart's doing, which is, although sitting in jail, she's being authentic to who she is. And so Pearl Hart starts, she says, I won't be tried under a law which my sex had no voice in making. That's a huge statement for 1889. And so I think for me, an outlaw on the cover just showed this person at a point of protest that's like fight, like it took her having to have a gun go against her morals, where, putting a stagecoach up for money just to thrive in the way that she felt she deserved. So I think that was the big interest for me. I think a lot of women in this audience probably feel that way still. We wish we could still rob a stagecoach, and probably feels great. But yeah, so I think that was that initial interest for me, and the belonging. I mean, for Pearl Hart to feel so at ease with, this is who I am, and I don't care if society says I'm one way or the other way. You're going to put me in jail. Side note, she did have an affair with the governor while in jail. So she was doing just fine. I mean, honestly.
We definitely need a feature-length film now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think belonging, right? I mean, everyone in this audience, all they want to do is belong. I don't care who in here, everyone has their emo playlist, and they go in a corner and they feel like, oh, I'm this outcast and no one understands me, and da-da-da-da. We all have done that before. But at the end of the day, we do all want to belong. We just want to belong in a way that everyone accepts us for our authentic self. So the reasons we don't be that way is because we think the only way you are going to love me is if I'm wearing women's clothing and exactly what you expect me to be. And so I think when someone really does own that, myself, let's say, if I really wanted to wear men's clothing all the time, maybe I'm insecure about it. Maybe I think, oh gosh, well, they're thinking I should be wearing this, or da-da-da-da-da. Really, probably at the end of the day, they're going, man, I wish I had the courage to do that. Man, I wish I could be that person. And that's what I loved about Pearl Hart, was she never let that part of her go with even laws telling her it was illegal. So.
Well, I do promise that in a minute I will open it up and give time for questions, but I do want to ask one last question. The three of you on stage. And again, part of the Autry's mission is not just to tell diverse stories of the American West, but to connect the past and the present. And so I wanted to kind of ask you, what do you see as the relevance of these histories today? Are there still kind of issues that seem to appear and reappear during charged times? I like the big questions. Claire.
Should I go? Yeah. Okay, I can get us started. I mean, I think these issues are directly relevant to the present time. I mean, the thing that most there's many things. The thing that most immediately comes to mind is just this wave of anti-trans legislation that's like been passing across the states the past couple of years. And we really sort of see there, again, this insistence on sort of binary, fixed gender, that people need to stay in those categories. And if they don't, that the state's going to come in and really regulate that. And one way that the state is doing that is via clothing, via names, the kind of like return of kind of like medical examinations to make sure that like children are going to be on the correct sports team. And I think that kind of the sort of state intervention into gender is like really, really visible right now. I think it's been there all along, but it's something that we're just directly seeing, and that I think is probably the first thing that comes to mind. There's others that I will pass on.
Yeah, I mean, just following up with that, I've been teaching undergraduates since 1995, and I have been really interested in recognizing that in the mid 90s and into 2000, when I would teach a class on the history of sexuality or sex in America or something like that, people wanted to talk about sexual identity. But for the last decade, students have really wanted to talk about gender variance. They wanted to talk about and self-sense about what one's fit is with what they think about with gender, and their attentiveness to other people and their genders. So there's a way in which we are actually at this really important moment where there's a whole host of a whole generational shift that's occurring, where there are many people who are 30 and under who are really actively engaged with socializing, experimenting with, thinking about gender variance, not feeling like things should be imposed on them, and expressing self-expression, but also forms of solidarity, because they really want to fight a sense of alienation imposed by ideas about how gender is perceived or imposed upon them. And that's one area of many. But I think that that's really the contest that's playing out, because when you have politicians, many of whom are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, 70s, 80s, who are freaked out about change, I'm like, oh man, for 80 years of your life, you've seen change all around you. Change is the constant. It's like constantly changing, and you're not supposed to understand everything about what another generation thinks or wants or feels or is, but you should listen, you should try to appreciate, and you should try to see that you're not harming them to impose a certain kind of morality or a certain kind of policing. Because that part, that contest of politics, that contest of power has been going on consistently around bodies and dress and about who people are and what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. And it's constantly been challenged in ways that are so evocative and sometimes subterranean. And we should be paying attention to both what's suppressed and subterranean and what's, immediately, viscerally evocative. I think that was really the project, the heart of what you've been doing. And yeah, and so you should have the final word on this.
Well, first of all, for anyone in the audience who's a little overwhelmed or freaked out by all the things we're talking about, just realize the Greek were doing this forever ago, and there's a lot of really great fruit involved. So a lot of pleasure. It was all good. They didn't care about holes or poles or where they went. So I want to throw that out there. And to that point, I think history, people these days, they have a huge yearning for, we see it in the film industry. Everyone wants, they want a biopic. They want something that's truth. They want something that's real. They want history, right? It's this, the past was so much cooler. Oh man, that was really neat. Well, sometimes...
You're getting head shakes.
Yeah. Well, sometimes history is like pregnancy. So you have the kid and it was horribly painful and terrible, and you love the kid and all your hormones go, hey, that was great. Let's do it again. That was awesome. Well, thank you, lady. Thank you, Mom, for having me on the 4th. So thank you. But also, history is like that. We want to go into the past and say, it was so good back then. I really loved that. I think exactly this. That's what it ties into, is that these laws back in 19th century. I grew up in California. I grew up thinking it was normal to see a naked guy walking down the street. That's no big deal. You've probably seen 3 this week. Who knows? So in my head, California, right? You can wear whatever you want. You can be whoever you want. There's this huge acceptance. So when I found out that San Francisco was one of the absolute worst places for dress codes, for discrimination against minorities, That was painful because I am always extremely proud of San Francisco and where I come from for being a place that is accepting of all and whoever the hell you want to be. So I think now I go, well, hey, how did these laws affect me, right? And I go, well, in my everyday life, I don't even realize I'm maybe labeling people. Maybe I'm labeling them on their sexuality, their economic status, whatever this is. And that's exactly what these laws over 100 whatever years ago, I can't even do math, 150 years ago, where are we at? But these laws all the way back then, that's exactly what they did. They've oppressed exactly the people they want, and it's gone all the way until 2022. And it's in my brain. It's just how we're socialized now. It's part of society. So I think it's directly relevant. And again, for all the women who related to the story of Rose, I mean, that's exactly it. So yeah, that's where I stand on that.
Well, I want to thank you for giving us a new metaphor for history. As well as thank everyone for opening up a great conversation. But I do want to give a chance for questions from the audience. I think we have Ben, who will also be helping running around with the mic. So if anyone would like to ask a question of anyone on the stage,
and just to allow as many people as possible, please keep your questions concise where possible.
Thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful subject material and putting that film together. It's terrific. And what a great panel. The question that I had was about a film called The Ballad of Little Joe, about Josephine Monahan. I just wondered if you guys had seen it, have feelings about it. And it was really important to me. That's the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing film. It was 1994, and it's about a woman who survives by comporting herself as a man. She's supported by this kind of older man who takes her on as an apprentice, but really thinks of her constantly as the little boy, the male, and stuff like that. She needs to get away from him. She like figures out a different kind of strategy. She rescues a Chinese man who's about to be lynched. And it's in the development of their relationship of support for each other, homesteading essentially, that all sorts of things unravel. It's a very powerful film. I'm trying to remember the name of the director, but it's also like, it's one of those films that like raises the other side of like trying to think about why people may have taken on that kind of the dress and the comportment and the identity of a man in order to survive, and also the incredible the specter of violence is constantly lurking around the ways in which she's having to navigate that choice. So I used to teach that a lot in in sort of Western history kind of classes, just because it was such a fascinating way of revealing a lot of these tensions that were going on, and also a lot of different possibilities that people lived in and stories we didn't often hear. So thanks so much for bringing it up. It occurred to me as I was watching your film, and I think it'd be kind of interesting as you're doing your research to take a look at that and see if there's some resonance. I'm trying to remember now, there's some pretty interesting actors that were involved. It was really great stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? Would be on the other side.
Thank you, Molly. Great short. 2 questions for you. What was the hardest thing in making this film? And then the whole not shooting the gun, is that a historical thing, or was that just for the character?
Yeah, wow, Shaka, with the questions, those are great. The not shooting the gun, so Pearl Hart, she had a pretty intense moral standing that she was just using the gun as a way to a scare tactic, essentially. So her moral grounding was she always had an empty gun. So they all fell for it, which was great, but she was never going to shoot anyone anyway. And I just thought that was really neat to have a moral outlaw. But it even shows even more how desperate she was for a better life. So, and then what was the other question was? What was the hardest thing about the shoot? Well, I'll make it as short as possible, but our first 12 hours was me in a hospital for 8 hours after 30 minutes of sleep because my beautiful friend, Maya Butler, got somehow bit by a rodent and went into anaphylactic shock, nearly died. So we were in a hospital in the entire night. I made cuts to the script, and then we went straight into shooting. A fire came through. We had another cast member have a lung reaction because of the fire, and then the production car, the key got lost, so we had no production car. The PA ran one of the cars into someone else's car, and then broke all the tents and got the RV parked in the exact shot I said don't put him there. So we had to. The smoke came through, blocked all of our locations. Then we had to redo all of our locations. We took 3 days to do. Well, the list. Wait.
I think you could do a film about making the film.
Oh man, the craziest part was somehow we had a good time. I don't understand that. We had everyone who was on that film are true filmmakers because man, if they went through that, they still are making films. It was I'm not kidding you. That was only 12 hours. It got worse. It just kept happening. They brought the wrong horses. I almost got bucked off of them the whole time. It was I had an allergic reaction. My throat was closing up. It just kept going. So every film has its thing, right? Every film is a hard film to make. Doesn't matter what you plan for, you can plan Z, something is gonna go wrong. So I think the hardest part was just keeping everyone still, happy and excited. And
It sounds like making a Western should come with a warning tag.
I think it was, we had rattlesnakes, forgot about that one. Yeah, but
you can make a film of that film, of what happened, right?
Yeah. Well, you know what? We had a great time. I don't mean to make it negative. We had a really good time, and we did. And honestly, the best part about film is problem solving. Because I'll tell you what, no matter what goes wrong, it always ends up being better. So you make better decisions, and you start making choices that are true to the story, rather than just we could put a crane here, and that's gonna be so cool. Not that I have budget for that, but. Anyway, yeah, so that was some of the stuff.
Being a historian and our scholar sounds much safer now.
Each of you have dedicated a significant amount of your time researching these incredible human beings, and then I'm sure you've stepped into their lives as well in this process. I guess what I'm really curious about is what's something that inspires you to keep going after all these months and years?
What a radio voice. Oh my God. Actually, he's very good looking too, so it's great. You can be in front of the screen, in front of the camera too.
But it's a fantastic question because
I don't know. Okay. Well, we met earlier. Sorry. Oh my God.
But it is a fantastic question because both of you deal with very difficult, complex histories that are troubling. So how do you work with that?
I do think that it's really about appreciating what people will endure and what someone endures and also creates for themselves. These projects that I've worked on, I would have to say the most, I just finished the book on hunger strikes. And so people are denying themselves food to communicate how untenable their life is and expecting someone will hear them. And I think that's extraordinary. To believe, to have the still amazing confidence that someone will hear you and act on your behalf or act to support you or want or care that you're in pain or in grief. And I wrote the book a lot during the pandemic, and I thought a lot about how that level of optimism of something, even in the direst of circumstances, is so, you can't turn away from it. And you have to sort of figure out, like, how can I bring that to the surface without, like, warping the integrity of that person's struggle. And I think that that's something of the discovery of all these different kinds of, seemingly dry documents you'd find in terms of legal records and newspaper accounts. How do you do that? How do you capture that in some way? And I think that that struggle is really a really important one, but it's also about, like, a shared sense of humanity about what people are going through.
Well, I'm actually going to let those be the last words, because it's nice to end on that note and to kind of remember that resilience and hope is also part of the story as well. And so I do want to thank Clare, Nayan, and Molly for just a fantastic and very fun panel as well. Yeah. And again, thank you so much for partnering with the Autry and being part of this group.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.